Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 15, which involves the discharge of contractual obligations. And so there's two primary learning objectives for this chapter. First, what is meant by discharge of contractual obligations? And then the second learning objective is how contract obligations are discharged. So that's going to be the overall focus for this chapter. When we talk about a contract coming to an end or its conclusion, what that means is that the rights, the duties, the obligations that flow from one party to another in an agreement, at that point they have ended and are now over. So no continuing relationship or obligation exists after that unless the contract is renewed, a new agreement is drafted and executed, or perhaps if an extension is granted. But beyond those kind of like limited examples, once everyone completes what they are supposed to as per the agreement, then it's over at that point, and no continuing relationship needs to be kind of perpetuated. The ways in which you can end a contract, so there's three broad categories. The first category is a combination of different variables that are just labeled collectively as actual performance. The best example there is, let's say you get a car loan for, let's say, 5 years, and for every month for 5 years you make the required payments. At the end of the 5 years you make your final payment. At that point the contract is terminated. You now own your vehicle outright. The title gets mailed to you, and there's no further payments that have to be made at that point. Action of the parties. This is where something is happening that usually means that the contract is going to be terminated early for some reason, and it doesn't necessarily mean in a positive way, and we'll get into some examples there. And then the last category is external causes, and so sometimes there are things that are outside the control of either party that impact the ability of the agreement to be performed or not. And again, it could be positive, but usually negative for that category as well. So when we talk about actual performance, I gave you the example of you making 5 years of payments, and at the end of the 5 years, the contract is complete. So that's great. There's also some things that pertain to what are called conditions related to performance. And so there sometimes are what are called conditions, and conditions can either give rise to a contract, can terminate a contract, or can reflect what are referred to as collectively as concurrent conditions. And so I'll kind of explain each one of those and provide an example for each. A condition precedent is a situation that has to occur before a party is obligated to perform. So let's say you decide you want to open up your own business, and you find a retail location that you think is ideal. Maybe it's got high traffic, it's on a road that gets a lot of focal point in the community, and so you decide I would like to try and lock down this property before somebody else comes in and perhaps leases or buys this parcel, and so what you do is you sign maybe whether it's to purchase or lease, you enter into a contract with the owner of the property, and what you want to do if the other party agrees to this is that you would like to have this subject to, let's say, zoning approval. So maybe your type of business, maybe it's a bar that you want to open up, and maybe that particular parcel of land is not zoned for that type of business. If you know anything about urban planning, usually every community is zoned for specific purposes. Could be residential, could be industrial, could be commercial, could be agricultural, depending on where you're at. And so you just don't even if you own the land, you just cannot violate what it's zoned for per se. But you can always request from the zoning commission, on a county by county basis, for a variance or rezone for your parcel of land. They're not obligated to kind of honor that, but they certainly would consider it. So, let's say you enter into this lease or purchase agreement for this parcel of land subject to zoning approval. If the zoning gets approved, then obviously the contract springs into life at that point. And whatever is required of you as the tenant or maybe the purchaser, that that obviously gets triggered at that point. If you get denied, then that contract never springs into life, and it never exists at that point. A condition subsequent is a situation where maybe a contract already is in existence and some event occurs that causes the contract to be terminated early. So let's say it's an employment agreement, and a lot of employers, when you're initially hired, you'll be required to take a drug test. That's very common nowadays. But what's less common is that you subject employees to random drug tests while they're in your employ. And so let's say that you're working and your name gets picked out of a hat, and they say, okay, Joe or Susie, go down to the lab and whatever, if it's blood, urine, hair sample, whatever it is, and let's say that you test positive, and we're assuming that it's not a false positive. At that point, you could be terminated, and you haven't done anything wrong in terms of your employable duties, but you have violated a requirement for employment there in terms of not having drugs in your system. And so even though otherwise it's a valid agreement that you are faithfully executing, but for that positive on a drug test, that contract will come to its termination and you'll be fired. The last category is what is referred to as a concurrent condition, and that's where things have to happen simultaneously. And then usually the contract springs into life and is executed in that simultaneous event. And so I frequently give the example of being in a grocery store. Everything on the shelf is an offer. You pick it up, that's acceptance. You take it to the register, they ring it up, and you pay, they give you your groceries, and you're on your way. And so remember, consideration is simultaneous. You give cash or some form of payment, they give you the groceries that you purchased at that point. That's also a concurrent situation. Everything's happening virtually simultaneously at that point. And so these are just some conditions that kind of lead up to, is the contract going to be performed or not, or is it going to be terminated early for some reason? Most contracts are discharged by actual performance, so people do what they say they're going to do as per the agreement, whatever is expected at certain time intervals in the lifespan of that contract. An offer to perform is referred to as a tender of performance. And the general rule, and it can vary depending on the type of contract and the state that you're in, but the general rule is that if a tender of performance is wrongfully refused, then the duty to perform is terminated. So we're near the end of the hurricane season, but let's say that, it's next summer. And so, the hurricane season's beginning up. And so, let's say in June, early July, I contract with, let's say, a tree trimming service to come out, and before the hurricane season really kind of gets under full swing, I want them to trim the trees. It's for safety, for my property and for the people around my property. And so let's say they show up on a Saturday, I schedule it. And what I didn't know was, maybe there's, some party that's going to be being held on my property. Maybe it's a birthday party or something. And so, the crew shows up, they're ready to do what they're supposed to do. And then I tell them, sorry, you guys can't work today. You got to come back another day. Well, depending on the company, they may actually try and reschedule, but they also could say, look, we have equipment, we've got the crew, we're here to work. And if you send us away, that's fine, but you still got to pay us at this point. And so, that would be an example where, they're there, to perform, and I'm wrongfully refusing their ability to perform. They haven't done anything wrong, and so payment would be expected at that point. If time of performance is an issue in a contract, then it does need to be articulated. You don't have to say in an agreement that, time is of the essence. You can just put in a contract, this needs to be completed by, and then put in a date, January 1st, July 31st, December 31st, whatever. So you don't have to give any kind of magical language to indicate that time is of the essence, although you can say that. But you usually, and I don't want to say always, but usually you cannot go wrong if you put, I need things completed by this date. And so it's very clear at that point, okay, I need to, have this done by whatever date has been indicated in the contract. So if you don't mention anything about time and performance in an agreement, everything by default seems to go back to, well, what is reasonable for what is being contracted. And so, it's just going to depend on the type of goods. Are they highly perishable, or not? Are we talking about produce, or are we talking about lumber? It's like, that's going to dictate that time window of acceptability if the contract does not specify any type of preference for time of completion. When we look at adequacy of performance, so there's a couple of different kind of standards that we can apply here. There's something referred to as substantial performance. And so substantial performance, if you look at the contract as being like broken up into percentages, 100% would be that you completed it in its entirety. 0% is that, you haven't started it at all yet. Maybe you have the contract was executed, but you've done nothing yet to further your obligation under it. So substantial is going to be something more than 50%. I give an approximate range of like 60s to 70% or more of completion. And so think of like a home, so, okay, let's say that, the home is not entirely completed. So it's not 100% complete, but maybe it's 2/3 to 3/4 of the way completed. And for some reason, the builder has to stop at that point. It's like, well, okay, the builder has substantially performed, but then what we're going to look at is, well, what is it going to take to actually complete performance? And so, not only, do we have to assess, and that could be by an expert, within whatever that field is. So let's say in building, an expert would have to come in and say, look, okay, there's like, 25% more that we have to do, or 30% more, whatever it is. And this is the estimate of what it's going to cost to complete. So that would be kind of deducted from the original contract from the party that did not complete their job, as required. Another thing that can also come up under substantial performance is the performance that was provided. Is it defective in any way? Because, again, let's say that this house example, sure, maybe it's 2/3 of the way completed, but let's say there's structural issues. Maybe you have to, it was wired and, for electricity and it has pipes for plumbing, but maybe they weren't up to code. And so you've got to tear out stuff and redo it. Well, that's going to impact the ability to defend that you substantially performed at that point. So though all those things are going to, impact the ability of you to say, well, okay, I know I didn't complete this as promised, but you owe me something. And so sometimes that is what ends up being litigated. What is that something that is owed at that point? If you have what are called specifications, and you basically provide that to a contractor for them to complete a task, and let's say when it's complete you don't like it for some reason, as long as those specifications were followed, then you really don't have any basis to try and challenge payment as required under the contract. One of the best examples, I had a contracts professor in law school named Vern Davidson, remarkably intelligent person, and he loved to cook. And he told us a story one day where he wanted to redesign his kitchen. And so, he kind of had what in mind, like cabinets and placement of the appliances and everything. And so he went to great expense to make this happen. And so he hired a contractor, told him his vision. He said, this is where I want everything laid out. This is what I want as per my specifications. The contractor followed everything precisely. When it was complete, he hated it more than the original kitchen. And he knew, he provided his specifications, and he knew that they were followed perfectly, that he had to pay. There was no basis to complain or to say that, I think it was defective, or, trying to wiggle out of his obligation under the contract. So just be careful if you do provide specifications, it's, and they follow it, then they need to be paid as promised. Satisfaction contracts, sometimes if you want to challenge the completion of work or how it was completed, it does need to be made in good faith. So if you say, well, this needs to be performed as per my satisfaction, You just can't be, picky and say, well, I don't like how you did this, and so I don't want to pay. There needs to be some good faith basis for that challenge. Discharge by action of the parties. So some situations that can arise here. There's a unilateral aspect of discharge. This is a very narrow window that's offered to consumers. It's called the Consumer Credit Protection Act, and it's the right to cancel a contract involving debt on your real property, so on your homestead, if it's made within 3 days of the execution of the contract. So let's say you decide that you want to get a second mortgage or maybe like a prime equity line on your dwelling, your house, condo, townhouse, whatever. So, whatever lender is going to, loan you or advance you money on this, you'll come in, you'll sign the contract, and they'll tell you you have 72 hours before the funds are going to be available. The reason why they do that is that within that 72-hour window, you could, decide, you could change your mind and say, look, I decided I don't want to do this. And so if you kind of like provide that notification, usually in writing, within 72 hours, then at that point the contract is canceled and no obligation has been created at that point. Contracts that can have what's called mutual rescission. So maybe both sides, maybe they haven't started performance yet, or maybe they have started and they realize this is going to be a more hairy than I had anticipated, and so can we just like not do this? And so that would be like a mutual rescission. If you find that you're unable to perform, if you can find someone that can step into your shoes, so that would be like a substitution. As long as the other party does not, challenge that or complain and say, no, I want you to do this. If they're okay with just anybody doing it, then you can always substitute and have another party come in to fill your shoes. You can also do what's called a novation. That's a new contract with a new party. Or you can do like an accord and satisfaction. That's when a dispute arises about an original contract, a new agreement has been drafted and then performed upon and executed at that point. So, the great thing with contracts is that, you have so much flexibility. The kind of like the key kind of ingredient that you have to have, though, is you have to have good communication with who you're entering into a contract with, so that as life happens, because it does, you want to make sure that everybody hopefully is on the same page, and you don't have to end up in court needlessly. I found that quite often parties, once something starts to not go as planned, communication starts to shut down, and that can be like a cancer for an agreement. And if the parties are not, or if they're not talking to each other, that's usually at that point attorneys start to get involved, and when attorneys get involved, things can escalate very rapidly. So it's very important that you try and maintain that a good open dialogue with who you have a contractual relationship with, so that if there are bumps in the road, you can say, look, we have a hiccup here, but let's fix this. Let's try and work around this if at all possible. And usually if you're able to do that, that creates a better long-term relationship with whoever that person is. So that if you're a retailer, it could be your wholesaler or manufacturer you're dealing with, things are going to happen, good and bad. And if you can maintain good communication, you can kind of weather those storms as they arise. In terms of some external causes, there's something called impossibility, and so maybe if it's something that is extremely rare, so like limited quantities, if it's damaged irreparably or maybe destroyed, obviously at that point the contract would be terminated. If there's maybe rezoning for property that makes whatever you were trying to do, illegal now from a zoning perspective, that would also kind of have the same, termination of the contract as well. If you're dealing with a sole proprietorship, this doesn't necessarily apply to corporations or partnerships. But if it's a sole proprietorship, and let's say the person who is the business, they die or become disabled for some reason, that usually is another reason why things get terminated as well. There's also something called commercial impracticability. And this is where, the contract could be discharged if performance is impractical because of some event that occurs. So it could be, usually what's required is that it was unforeseeable. So it could be a natural catastrophe. Think of the wildfires, that out west they experience usually every summer into every fall. Think of, here in the southeast with hurricanes as they kind of come through. Those might be some examples of this idea of commercial impracticability. Another thing is temporary impossibility. So, maybe it's a storm, but it isn't that severe, so maybe things are shut down for a couple of days. So, you would normally get an extension, to kind of reflect that, and maybe there's a labor issue, whatever it is, if it's something that's truly temporary in nature, usually what results or translates into this situation is a delay of performance by a few days or a week or so, whatever is mandated. The last area where it can be because of external causes is by what's called operation of law. And so if there is a change in the legislative framework, and this could be at a federal, state, or local level, so, considering our federal system of government, then obviously that would terminate the contractual agreement. So bankruptcy is a great example. That has a way of, putting all contractual obligations on the table of the debtor, and either those contracts are going to be outright discharged or they're going to be renegotiated so that maybe there's, the principal is reduced, the interest rate is reduced, payments are reduced. So the original agreement is gone and something new emerges potentially. The idea of statute of limitations, the idea that, if you have a cause of action, let's say in contract or in tort, there is an expiration to it. So, let's say it could be 2 to 4 years, depending on what we're discussing. And if you go, a day past that, then, it's at that point it's discharged, your ability to recover, even if you had a great contract issue at dispute. The last thing is if there is a time limitation that's stated in the contract, so again, if you kind of waive your right to the statute of limitations in lieu of maybe, this other optional time window, and you go past that, then at that point it's terminated as well. So anyway, hopefully, you have a better appreciation now for ways in which contracts are discharged and the impact that has on the agreement. If you have any other questions, please feel free to message me. You can call, text, or email me anytime, and I'll be more than happy to get back with you as soon as possible. But do have a good, safe, and productive rest of the week, and I'll be chatting with you all online. Thank you so much.